It's The Real News. I'm Dharna Noor. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia is the new head of the Select Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. And we're going to talk about what that means today. We're going to talk about Joe Manchin's record when it comes to energy and natural resources and climate change with our new climate change investigative reporter, Steve Horn. You may know Steve as a regular guest on the Real News Network. He's going to now be reporting for us. And his latest piece for the Real News is Senate Energy Democrats hire former industry lobbyists to lead staff. Thanks for being here, Steve.
Good to be here. Good to be in the studio.
So before we talk about Manchin's latest hires to lead the minority staff on the Senate committee, let's talk a little bit about who Joe Manchin is. If viewers are watching this, if you know anything about Joe Manchin, you might know that he's sort of famously bipartisan. He was one of the only Democrats to oppose same-sex marriage and a lack of funding for Planned Parenthood. He also famously shot Obama's cap-and-trade proposal in a campaign ad. And opposed Obama's Clean Power Plan regulations. Talk a little bit about what Joe Manchin could mean for climate policy.
Well, the biggest thing that Manchin is pushing today that makes him relevant, in regardless of if the Senate does nothing legislatively on climate change that moves across their desks, it still wouldn't matter in terms of what the biggest thing he's doing is, which has nothing to do really with the Senate, and that's something that's going through the Department of Energy right now, which he has heavily backed in his own home state, and that is the Appalachian Development Group's proposal to create a massive petrochemical hub in the state of West Virginia. Petrochemicals are, of course, one thing that gas, which is obtained from fracking, could be created out of that, mostly created right now in the Gulf of Mexico. But there's a proposal right now by the petrochemical industry, by the oil and gas industry, to create the equivalent of that same infrastructure in Appalachia, and that would be headquartered in West Virginia. And so that already has a lot of financing and has $83 billion lined up from China, pretty much guaranteed, which is bigger than the entire GDP right now of the entire state of West Virginia, to put that into perspective. So it's massive. But what makes him relevant is that besides the fact that that's already lined up, that's been through the state government. Of course, he's at the federal level. At the federal level, there is right now an additional $1.9 billion financing that they would like to get for that same project through the Department of Energy, through the National Energy Research Laboratory. And through that, they just got kind of an ally, a guy that Manchin has been speaking with, and has been part of lots of public forums together on this issue. So he's a professor at West Virginia University. His name is Brian Anderson. He was actually just named, looking at the revolving door, named to head up the National Energy Research Laboratory, the same one that will decide whether or not they get that close to $2 billion additional grant money to create that petrochemical hub. So whether or not it's a legislative thing or not, there has been legislative proposals, but they've been more symbolic. Manchin's office has been working behind the scenes to help facilitate a lot of this stuff I just talked about over the past 2 or 3 years.
And we should say that, Steve, you did a report on this for DSMOG last week. If you're interested in learning more, check it out.
2 weeks ago, yeah. Before I joined the Real News
just
Network.
Before.
My last thing, yeah.
Speaking of the revolving door from the energy lobby, from the industry into the Senate sphere, let's talk about who you uncovered that Manchin has hired to head the minority staff on this E&R committee.
Yeah, so the first news organization, and the only one to have reported on it before the Real News Network, was Greenwire. They had simply reported on the fact that Manchin, as his leadership role in the minority for the Senate Energy and Natural Resource Committee, had hired a woman by the name of Sarah Venuto Perez, and they talked about her lobbying background. And so that's important. Her lobbying background is she was the head of federal governmental relations, or the head federal lobbyist for the America's Natural Gas Association, or ANGA as they were known, until recently there was an acquisition of ANGA by the American Petroleum Institute, which I think goes to show how powerful ANGA was. That
the American Petroleum Institute
is the biggest lobby,
oil and gas lobby in the country.
And so, but ANGA was the voice of the fracking industry for roughly a decade before that, and had a lot of influence, in particular, on the issue of the Halliburton loophole, as it's known, which allows for the industry, when they do fracking or horizontal drilling, not to disclose what chemicals they are injecting into underground and potentially into people's drinking water, their groundwater, if you rely on a well for your water, and which lots of people do in rural America. So ANGA was super, besides a bunch of other issues like methane emissions, and trying to stop any regulations of those, methane being a greenhouse gas that is more potent than even carbon dioxide in its first 20 years in the atmosphere, which is the key timeline that we're talking about if we need to do something on climate, is in that time period. So ANGA's been huge on that. And, if you look at who was doing that, that's Sarah Venuto Perez. If you look at her, which is what we did for this story, I looked at the federal lobbying disclosure stuff, and she was lobbying on those very things, like methane emissions, like she was pushing to do quote-unquote reform of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which is kind of the main law that is used to create some protections at the federal level for projects that are being proposed, to ensure that there are environmental protections, to ensure that there are protections for indigenous population, among water protections, air protections. The industry hates that bill, but it's kind of like the staple of environmental law in the United States of America. So she has been lobbying on that. And then in her past career before ANGA, she had lobbied against even basic greenhouse gas regulations, lobbied for bills that would put multi-year hiatuses on regulations of those under the Clean Air Act. So she has a long track record from a variety of viewpoints of opposing pretty much doing anything to curb climate change from the perspective of the oil and gas industry. And
more broadly, even opposed the ability of the federal government to regulate anything, right? She supported, or she lobbied for SCRUB. Is
the Scrub Act, yes. Yeah, so the Scrub Act, that's an acronym for, it's so long I have to read it, the Searching for and Cutting Regulations That Are Unnecessarily Burdensome Act. So that's kind of like a one-for-one piece of legislation.
You put in one regulation,
and
you have to take away another. Away.
Yeah, and so that's something that she supported. That is a bill that in particular has been lobbied for a long time by the Koch brothers and their network. It's never really come true, but it's becoming more and closer to becoming true. For example, President Trump, during one of his first months in office, did push forward a executive order saying that he supports that kind of thing. It hasn't actually been realized, but it has motion under the Trump administration, and that is another thing she lobbied for. And you have to remember, we're talking not about a Republican here. We're talking about a pretty committed Democrat. This is a woman who gave close to $3,000, $2,900 to Hillary Clinton for her 2016 campaign. Hillary Clinton was the biggest money given as a federal candidate was to Hillary Clinton, $11,000. So a good chunk
from the American Natural Gas,
from employees, through their political action committee or their PAC. And so, 1/4 of that amount of money came from Sarah Venuto Perez, given to that, which went to Hillary Clinton. So she's not, she's conservative, I guess, in the traditional sense that she supports the oil and gas industry and no regulations, but
certainly
she's
not
a committed Democrat.
Republican.
Yeah.
But the Republicans, of course, still have majority control in the Senate.
Yes.
So talk about what's happening on their end of this. What's going on the Republican side of this, the ENR committee, the Energy and Natural Resources?
Yeah, it's noteworthy because it shows an interesting level of bipartisanship. I think and I'll get into that in a second because it has been realized through policy. But just looking at the personnel, they also have a communications director who in the past worked at the same time at America's Natural Gas Association with Venuto Perez. So she was kind of more in the communications wing. Venuto Perez was the lead federal lobbyist. They literally worked there.
So Venuto's Republican counterpart in
Colleague.
the ENR committee
Yes.
was
They were
her
colleagues.
colleague at ENGA.
Yes.
Which is, again, just to be clear, ENGA that has now merged with the American Petroleum.
And I'll say that there's another piece of the oil and gas lobbying, influence peddling industry known as the Independent Petroleum Association of America. The same woman, her name is Nicole Daigle. She, who is the communications director of the committee on the Republican side, so that means for the committee as a whole, because they're in the majority. She was their lead federal lobbyist from 2012 through 2014. So I think that's roughly overlaps when that same time period when Sarah Venuto Perez was lobbying for ENGA. So most likely they were lobbying for a lot of the same bills. They're both, and they were the lead lobbyists for both of these two extremely influential trade associations in Washington, D.C. And so now they're both in very senior level staff positions in this influential energy committee in the Senate. So any energy related bill has to go through this particular committee. And so those two will be working as senior staffers on those particular issues.
And what does it mean to work as a senior staffer on a committee like this? I think there was quite a bit of reporting when Manchin was, made head of this select committee about his record, about the things that his political agenda in a sense. But what role does a senior staffer have in sort of shaping that political agenda and shaping what it's possible for that select committee to accomplish?
Yeah, well, it's a two-tiered thing. So I think a staffer shows the agenda. I think like the background of a staffer shows or gives signs of what the agenda of the politician will be, and that is because the senator is an extremely busy person, traveling, going from the floor of the Senate, going to meetings, doing all kinds of things. They rely a lot on the staff to actually do a lot of meetings with people, facilitate bills moving forward.
You should know you worked on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I worked
on
Capitol Hill I was an intern, but yeah, that is exactly how it works. The senators are just flying, sometimes they have to go back to their districts. So like their staff in D.C., especially the senior staff, is extremely important on policy. And so in this case, when you're the senior staffer of a committee, you're going to be doing all of the policy work basically. And you'll report back to your boss, he'll kind of tell you what to do, but she's the one that's involved in all the day-to-day stuff on negotiating bills or communicating with the industry. They're, because the senator's just so busy. They're also a figurehead in their state, so they have to go to just kind of strange constituent events. So they rely a lot on their staff to do the actual work and the day-to-day office stuff that is involved with passing legislation or bills.
And I guess we should wrap up by talking about what this could mean for other kinds of Democrats. As you note in the piece, there's sort of a bigger divide growing on climate change in the Democratic Party. There's obviously this a stronghold that the energy lobby, that the fracking lobby, generally that industry has on a certain segment of the Democratic Party. But there's a new emerging wing of the Democratic Party, too. We've seen Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other freshman senators like Rashida Tlaib push the proposal for a select committee on a Green New Deal to phase out of fossil fuels within the next 10 years. They were actually pushing for whoever received any fossil fuel contributions to be on that committee. What impact could this sort of wing being in control of this Energy and Natural Resources Committee on the Senate have on their ability to get anything done to pass something like a Green New Deal? Obviously, that Nancy Pelosi in the House shut down the proposal for a committee on the Green New Deal, but they're expected to release, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and another kind of old head Democratic Party leader, Ed Markey, are expected to release a bill next week that would call for some of the same proposals that they were pushing for in that select committee. Yeah,
so I think that the important thing to point out here is that maybe not this whole bill that we're talking about, the Green New Deal bill or whatever other kinds of legislation comes out of that. A lot of it would have, if it involves energy, it's going to have to go through the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So that means it's going to go across Manchin's desk. That means it's going to go across Sarah Venuto Perez's desk. And so that's what makes her relevant in this picture. That's what makes Manchin relevant, because in the unlikely event that they do get some Republican support for this, which is unlikely, but you never know how things will play out in politics when deals are made, and maybe the deals we made that will make the bill less powerful for combating climate change, but we'll see. But with all that said, you still have Manchin there as probably someone who they're going to have to get around or get through, depending on where things go. So that's what makes it important for the Green New Deal and for what transpires in the next several weeks or months, or I guess a couple of years until the 2020 election.
All right. Well, thanks for following the staffers for us. Obviously, you will keep me posted, so we will keep you posted about what Steve continues to dig up going into this session. Thanks so much for being here, Steve.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
And go to therealnews.com or probably below right now and check out the full piece that Steve wrote for The Real News about Sarah Venuto Perez. It's called Senate Energy Democrats Hire Former Industry Lobbyists to Lead Staff. I'm Dharna Noor, and thanks for watching.